We have Athan Stephanopoulos, who is the publisher of NowThis. He has helped bring the NowThis brand into the #1 position as a news publisher across Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. He came to NowThis is now within the Vox family, but Athan came to the company as the founder and CEO of Clip-O-Matic. Please welcome Athan Stephanopoulos.
Here it is. Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. As Steve mentioned, my name is Athan Stephanopoulos. I am the publisher of NowThis. A little quick context, as Steve mentioned, NowThis recently was part of a holding company called Group 9 Media, which was acquired by Vox Media. So we have recently now come into the Vox Media ecosystem, of which we have 18 brands. What I thought I would do today when I was asked to speak was, and it's given me a chance to kind of go back and do a little bit of a history lesson for myself about NowThis and kind of the journey that we've been on, and really use NowThis as the case study of how we see a shifting landscape across media. And so in many ways what I did was kind of just look at the history. For those who do know us or those who don't know us, I'll give you just kind of a little history. We launched the company in late 2012, in December of 2012, so we're approaching our 10-year anniversary. And starting there, the reality is we built the concept of NowThis at a moment of time where we had no legacy business to protect. We were starting of kind of where is the landscape. So, quickly went back. I was able to kind of dig up some old brand deck slides and kind of how we positioned the company back in late 2012 and early 2013. One of our co-founders had said, this is really about the changes that we're seeing in media consumption, particularly for young people. And we all kind of recognize today what that really means, but at that moment of time is we saw an opening. We saw a lot of white space, and that was young people were going to be consuming media content more broadly, but we looked at it through the lens of news content. We say news with the little n, in a way in which that they wanted to consume it where they're not going to buy a print magazine, they're not going to turn on the television, but we knew where they were. So that was the genesis of this concept. We wanted to build a media brand from the ground up, targeting young audiences. Now, if you look at it, as Steve said, and this is a term that we often, really kind of define, and NowThis, we believe we pioneered something that at the time we didn't even know what was happening, and that was looking at what was the way digital publishers as a whole back in 2012, 2013, 2014 were trying to actually build audience development. Really what that meant was, we can use the ESPN as an example. In the early 90s, we knew we had to get people directly to site, and you monetize from there. Then you start getting into the search phase, and what we saw was that mostly people were using social when social came on in the early 2000s, 2010, as a marketing tool, right? And so, again, going back to a brand deck, this was something I found that how we defined it, that's we saw publishers, traditional publishers, using social as a marketing tool and link tool to get to the content itself. We took a very different model. And again, in many ways, I remember a moment where I was sitting with our board saying, we have a limited amount of resources. How are we going to try to drive audience? And we famously, and it's since changed, and I'll talk about it shortly, we shut down our website, actually, in 2015. And because we were in audience development mode. That's all we were really focused on, and we knew it was going to be very, very costly to try to drive audience to a site. So we went fully in, and if you look at some of the logos here, some of those platforms don't even exist any longer. We were on Vine, right? The 6 seconds of video, et cetera. There was an app called Yo, which was a messaging app. And so what we've done as part of the DNA of NowThis from the early days is always trying to understand where emerging platforms are, and we'll talk about that as it relates to the shifting landscape. But if you look at it from a content perspective, what does this really mean? What does it look like? And we always saw it as what we would define as platform-appropriate content. Make content that is unique to each of the platforms that you're publishing on. Now, if you go all the way back to 2013, when these were the core platforms, this was our coverage of Nelson Mandela's death. And the only two platforms that really supported actual video at that time was Facebook and Twitter. You could natively post video on Twitter back then. You were just beginning to natively post video onto Facebook back then. Everything else was, Instagram at the time was still only visual photo posts. Vine was obviously, it was video, but 6 seconds. And even at Snapchat, that was long before they launched Discover, which we were one of the earliest publishers on. They were just visual graphics in which we brought a designer to kind of build audience and can bring the news to the audience. So if you look at the first 5 years, the way I define it is the first 5 years for us was really about audience growth. And that really came through the lens of daily content. Cadence matters, high frequency. It's, Rob mentioned around whether it's news, trending news, and then thinking about evergreen. We weren't thinking about evergreen in the early days. It was about high volume, really trying to build the audience and understand what they could get from us. What we also really did in that moment of time, if you had followed us, is when we first launched, we had our main channel, particularly on Facebook. That's where I'd say most people have come to know NowThis. But we really diversified pretty quickly, and we used data and insights as an indicator and a trigger on where we would expand. And so we ultimately launched 13 different channels just on Facebook alone, and that was NowThis Politics, and that was where we can get more specific for the audience that wanted political coverage. We did NowThis Entertainment. We did NowThis Her, covering stories around equity and equality for women. So really trying to use that first phase of, it's very hard to monetize if you don't have a loyal, large audience. And so for us, looking at the landscape of, as we've built the brand that is now quite well known, and we'll talk a little bit about the stats, that first kind of half of our life was really about audience growth. Then if you kind of look about 2017 onwards, this is really the moment where I would say most people, we've become synonymous with taking over your news feeds. You see our content in kind of every major platform today. So what I thought I would do is just quickly share, again, an older video. This was a kind of a brand video that we had done back in 2017 that really defines the extension of the programming, how it kind of grew out, the audience size that we have. And then I'll talk a little bit more about where we see the shifts, even from today, I'd say, over the past 2-3 years, and where we see it going, and how it, I think, is going to be disrupted yet again.
This is our moment.
This next story will remind you that, yes, there is still some good left in the world.
It really feels like they've formed a community.
NowThis tells the most important stories
That matter right now.
That's when the best stuff happens.
We need to make this a little more human than what exists now.
Moving forward with compassion, this is an important story.
No matter what it is that you can do something.
Every one person, every one voice, every one conversation makes a difference.
These important stories have the power to move us all.
So really what that was meant to do is to give some context about, we had built a fairly large audience. We knew that by 2017, as you saw some of the stats, we were doing well over 1 billion video views a month. We really had penetrated kind of the Gen Z and millennial marketplace, have become a trusted voice for them. But obviously, we're all in this business to also, where's the business side of this? And so, we found a very unique, we made a risky bet. I've been approached on this numerous times, is we built the brand on a distributed model in which we were at the mercy, so to speak, of a lot of these platforms. Now, obviously, you saw on a platform like Facebook, where we probably grew the most, they started introducing and built a more mature, robust monetization model with programmatic advertising, both pre-roll, mid-roll, et cetera. But when you start to get to a scale of that size, the sales team was able to go direct and we continue to do a lot of branded content with our partners. We do a lot of sponsored editorial programming around the series that we've developed. So there's been multiple ways as the brand has, kind of achieved the size and scale that it has. But really in the back, half of the past 5 years in terms of where we're at is recognizing the value of IP. We realize we've been able to not only create that content in these platforms where the audiences are living, but to be able to do it in a franchise way in which other brands can join us for the ride. It's where do we monetize the scale and reach that we have now? And again, obviously on platforms like Facebook, to a lesser degree, Twitter, and Snapchat are the three platforms where you have programmatic advertising. Where you don't see that is on Instagram, you don't see that on TikTok, and now, as we'll talk about in a little bit, some of the other platforms and how they've evolved. But I wanted to talk quickly about the trends really now in the back, from 2018 to essentially present day. I think this is no surprise. We're seeing a flattening of audience growth on a platform like Facebook, yet it's still a very, very large, important audience. One thing we can state for us, we grew pretty excessively on a platform like Facebook, but again, we are a news brand for young people, and we recognize that the age demographics have shifted, and so has our own strategy. So we've had, quite frankly, had to disrupt ourselves a little bit as well. That we've built where I would say our legacy business in some ways is what we've done on Facebook, but now we are looking at emerging platforms. On YouTube, yeah, you still start to see some real growth, but there's some interesting trends about some parallels between all these platforms. But no surprise here, the one platform that's really kind of changed the game over the past 3 to 4 years has been TikTok, surpassing both audience size meaningfully compared to a Snapchat or a Twitter. And yet, Snapchat, they launched Discover. We've done very, very well on Discover, both in what the channels that we have, what we're doing both programmatically and what the ad sales team is able to do. But we still, right now, I look at TikTok like we saw Facebook maybe 5 years ago. This is all about audience growth. Again, NowThis was probably the earliest publisher in a meaningful way. We got on about 2.5, 3 years ago. Now you're seeing more mainstream news publishers and legacy brands all on the platform. We are the largest media publisher on each one of those social platforms in terms of our competitive set. We have about 5 million followers today on TikTok and growing still quickly. But what is really interesting is that you're starting to see an interesting trend happen. So now, fast forward from the slide I showed you from about 5 years ago. Again, Vine's no longer on there. Kick, which is a messaging app, is not there, and you have WhatsApp. But what you do have is obviously TikTok, which is a very different platform, and even YouTube now has YouTube Shorts, right? So that's the YouTube Shorts logo. What you're seeing is the likes of Facebook shift, and everybody's moving more towards a vertical format. That is becoming a dominant media type. Not surprising, there was the famous efforts of Quibi, who spent billions of dollars to try to build an audience and spend excessive amounts of money on premium programming. And I think Steve said it earlier, we're really competing for people's attention and time, whether you're a publisher and where the audiences are living, and understanding these trends of how young people are consuming content. This is what we focus at NowThis, quite frankly, in a kind of maniacal way, is how is the behavior and the shifts changing, and so we need to change with that, and we want to help lead that. And then you see it also in the formats, right? And so what was historically over the past few years a 16:9 video in your feed on your phone, and as you see the example here, this is one example of a series that we had developed that we would bring in editorial sponsors to support it. But the formats are changing, and you saw that even in the way we produced content on these platforms. You're in a phone environment. You're swiping through, and if you watch a 16:9 video, it takes very little real estate on the screen. And so we started leaning into 4:5 before we even had Reels and vertical. Square video, and would see a higher performance of retention, watch time, engagement, all the metrics that signal the interactions with the content. So this didn't exist when we launched the brand, and yet we're still such a young brand, relatively speaking, to some of the other publishers. But these are the lessons that we take into account as we're kind of looking at the landscape of opportunities. As I mentioned, too, a lot of our focus, too, is around building repeatable IP and franchises that our audiences come to know us for and love. And so we've seen a huge opportunity where our daily news, our trending news is what kind of captures your attention. For us, what we see, especially in social, is relevancy has a deadline. In order to keep your audience engaged and keep coming and interacting with you, it's the high volume cadence I talked about earlier. But you also need to start creating content that they can kind of stick Two, it's evergreen. They can have a relationship with it, and you can start to put it elsewhere. This has been something, as we've launched more IP, has done two things. From a sales side, it's given the sales team more opportunity to take what we have in the marketplace, but it's also extended our efforts into long-form programming. One other quick industry slide that I want to mention, because it correlates to the last point that I'll mention, is just seeing both the trends of consumption, which we've talked about, and then how does that correspond with kind of revenue projections and ad revenue in media. So for us as almost an exclusively digital video brand, we're seeing some plateauing of the social platforms. A lot of that's driven, quite frankly, by Facebook, just because of its pure size, but you are still seeing audience growth in some of the emerging platforms like TikTok. But the good news is that the ad revenue is, as usual, a little bit behind the eyeballs. And so if these numbers hold true, we remain optimistic of where the marketplace is going, is that the ad community is going to start to catch up to where the audience and the eyeballs are. But what it means is understanding, even as an advertiser, what we've understood as a publisher, and that is creating platform-appropriate content. If you're going to create something and enter into that conversation with your consumers, how do you do it in a way that makes sense if you're doing it in a vertical Reels format versus something else? So, kind of the last two quick slides for us here is how we've broken up our programming buckets, and to give some context here, and that how it corresponds with where we see some of the greatest opportunities revenue-wise. So our daily videos, whether that's interviews, field stories, in the studio, that's programmatic. That's what's going to be running across all of the social platforms, going to monetize in different ways and with rising CPMs on the likes of Facebook and Twitter. The series and franchises is what really arms our sales teams, both from a sponsored standpoint and for branded content. We've also gotten into expanding a lot of partnerships where we have a lot of organizations that want to support and underwrite original reporting, and it's in the case of news, which is very important in these days, but that drives another opportunity for us. And then lastly, which we've really extended, which is probably less known for individuals who know us because they probably think of us as just that short form social video brand, is long form. And so we've been known for covering a number of issues that are impacting young people today and turning those into long form narrative projects to docs, and then we've been selling that. We've done deals with, in this case, a recent series that we launched called Uprooted with Discovery Plus. We have something on Netflix. We co-produced a short film 2 years ago in the wake of George Floyd's murder that got turned into a short film that won the Academy Award. So now we've seen an opportunity to extend our brand equity and in terms of a revenue opportunity, driving long-form licensing. So
Athan,
that is Now This.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions of Athan. I know that that NowThis experimented with being a channel. I saw NowThis pop up as an OTT channel on especially some of the early AVOD platforms. What has happened? How has that evolved in terms of what the OTT strategy is? Does NowThis support itself? Can it support itself as a brand, as an independent station within that context, or have you discovered that you're really best off doing it piece by piece throughout the social platforms?
Yeah, I think in many ways that's an important question relative to how when we first launched, and we made a concentrated decision to say you have limited resources and you're trying to build a brand and build an audience and an authentic audience. So the early days was very much focused on trying to build the audience and go to where the audience is. We have built enough brand equity today that we feel we're in a position to be able to start building OTT opportunities. And now that particularly we live within the Vox Media ecosystem too, we're able to leverage both the content we do and our sister brands to be able to, penetrate those areas in a more effective way. So that's an area that I think as we look into 23 and 24, that's the plans.
Hi, Chris Fairman with Tegna. So you mentioned on just the previous slide about partnerships with impact programming. Do you mind going into that a little deeper? Sure.
So we launched a division about 2 years ago, right before the pandemic. I say everything's kind of blurry in the pandemic times, called NowThis Impact. And this was an opportunity where we saw, especially in the news space as well, and for a young news brand that's all ad supported, and the challenge is to just be, a news property to begin with, and how that has its inherent challenges for the ad community, is we saw that there were a couple key areas of priority editorially that we wanted to focus on, particularly knowing the audience. One was climate and sustainability, understanding that that was the single biggest issue for our audience. So we also looked at through the lens of that young people, Steve mentioned at the top, now this is demonstrated and kind of proven to the marketplace that, yes, young people do care about news. And what we saw was that's really hard to take out to advertisers and say, let's talk about voter rights, let's talk about immigration, and let's talk about climate change. So we launched NowThis Impact, and we collaborated with organizations like Emerson Collective, which is started by Lorene Powell Jobs, where we were able to do deep original reporting on these topics like climate change, how it's impacting communities and individuals. And these were underwritten by partners like Emerson Collective. And we saw an opportunity where, in many ways we define it now as, solutions-based journalism. And that young people particularly don't want to just be informed of what the problem is, but how can I be part of the solution? And we feel we have a unique opportunity to do that. And that's an area of the business that we are leaning into, because we also recognize that while you're in your phone and you're on TikTok and you're on Snap and you're watching a video, it's a lot easier to get somebody to swipe up and take an action than it is when you're trying to get them from one site to another to take other action. So we're trying to leverage the audience where we have them and to take action on it. And that's an opportunity that we have to go and have conversations with partners.
Athan, let me ask you one exit question about revenue. You showed us that previous slide about what the breakdown looks like, but what does the mix look like now in terms of share? How reliant are you guys on programmatic through social as opposed to sponsor and branded content?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was very nervous about in the early days, because we grew so quickly, particularly on a platform like Facebook. And again, we had a little bit of runway and protection as a venture-backed business in the early days. Your job is to go build a brand and an audience. I think we did that well, but the concern was always to say our largest audience and the largest revenue stream was on distributed and programmatic coming from Facebook. But what we've done is we quickly diversified while a lot of people were not watching, and that was we got on to Snapchat as the earliest publisher of Discover and start to extend our audience there and the revenue streams there. We got onto platforms like IG, even though that's not monetized right now. We have kind of, again, I'd say a leadership position in terms of the size of audience that we have as they consider to think about how monetization will come into play like that. So that's programmatic. We've also been very aggressive. Our ad sales team has been great, especially under the roll-up within the holding companies, to be able to go out and sell across all of our properties and brands. So we've actually seen now where we're really pretty well diversified across our revenue streams, both on programmatic, our ad sales side, again, both in terms of direct branded and sponsored editorial. We've seen a lot of growth in our partnerships. And licensing does two things. It definitely drives revenue, top-line revenue. The margins are always going to be a little bit lower when you're doing a long-form program on a Netflix, but it also actually builds brand health and brand equity. So we feel very bullish across all revenue buckets and where we see the margin contributions of each.
Athan Stephanopoulos, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.